1,000 missiles are locked and loaded and aimed at the Islamic Republic of Iran, with thousands more to immediately follow. That's not a line from a movie script. That's a direct quote from a post President Trump published this month in response to what he and his own administration describe as an active, ongoing plot to assassinate him. Iran, for its part, hasn't backed down either. Its new supreme leader has publicly vowed revenge for his father's death. Mourners at that funeral carried banners with 3 words on them: "Kill Trump." Tonight, we're going to walk through exactly what's been threatened, what's actually been confirmed, and why the most dangerous part of this story might not be either threat on its own, but the possibility that one side misreads how serious the other one actually is. Here's why this matters beyond the alarming headlines. When a sitting American president threatens to decimate and destroy an entire country in response to a personal threat against his own life, and reportedly leaves standing instructions for his vice president to act on that threat if he's killed, we're no longer talking about ordinary diplomatic friction. We're talking about a mechanism where a single successful attack or even a single false alarm could trigger consequences neither government may have fully thought through in advance. Understanding how we got here and how much of this is genuine operational threat versus political theater matters for anyone trying to gauge how close this war actually is to spiraling further out of control. My name is David Whitmore, Chief International Analyst for Breaking News Analysis. Tonight, we're breaking down the assassination threats against President Trump, his response, and what this escalation actually tells us about where this war stands right now. Let's get into it. Let's start with what's actually documented, because the emotional intensity around this story makes it easy to lose track of what's confirmed versus what's alleged. On July 9th, Iran held the funeral for former Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, who was killed in the American and Israeli airstrikes that opened this war back in February. According to Reuters, some mourners at that funeral carried banners reading directly, "We will kill Trump." Khamenei's son and successor, Mojtaba Khamenei, posted a statement the same week vowing to avenge, in his words, the blood of the martyred leader, calling it a demand of the nation that must certainly happen. Now hold on, because there's an important distinction buried in that sentence that's easy to miss if you're moving quickly through this story. A crowd carrying a banner at a funeral and a new head of state vowing generalized revenge for his father's killing is not, on its own, evidence of a specific operational plot against the president's life. It's inflammatory, and it's a serious signal about the political mood inside Iran's leadership. But it's a different category of thing than what came next. According to reporting from the Wall Street Journal and confirmed by other American outlets, Israel shared specific intelligence with the United States describing an alleged Iranian plot to assassinate President Trump. Separately, Mike Waltz, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, told ABC News directly that Iran has operatives inside the United States and that the threat, in his words, going all the way up to the Ayatollah, has existed for years. The Treasury Department has since sanctioned an individual described as an alleged Iranian financier connected to this activity. That's a meaningfully different, more concrete set of claims than a funeral banner, and it's worth treating it with the seriousness it deserves, while also being honest that, as of this recording, the underlying intelligence itself hasn't been made public, which means outside verification of exactly how advanced or credible this specific plot is remains limited to what officials have chosen to say about it. Here's what nobody covering this story enough is asking directly: is this actually new? Because the honest answer is only partially. This isn't the first time Iran has been connected to threats against Trump's life. Back in 2024, the FBI accused an Afghan-born man named Farhad Shakeri, who had lived in the US but relocated to Tehran, of accepting payment from the Revolutionary Guard to surveil and plan an attack on the president. In January of this year, Iranian state television aired footage referencing the July 2024 shooting in Butler, Pennsylvania, where a gunman's bullet grazed Trump's ear during a campaign rally, with on-screen text in Farsi reading, "This time, it won't miss." That's a chilling escalation in rhetoric, but it's also part of a pattern that predates the current war by years. Not a threat that materialized out of nowhere this month. That pattern matters for understanding the broader security context, too, separate entirely from Iran. Trump has now faced multiple, well-documented threats to his life over roughly 2 years. The Butler shooting in July 2024, a man found hiding with a rifle outside his Florida golf club 2 months later, and a gunman who opened fire at the White House Correspondents' Association dinner this past April. Sabrina Singh, a former deputy Pentagon press secretary under the previous administration, put it plainly in comments to PBS. Iran wanting to target senior American officials is something U.S. intelligence already knows is happening. And these threats have to be treated as credible, regardless of how you weigh any single specific claim. There's a deeper personal layer to Iran's animosity toward Trump specifically that goes back years before this current war, and it resurfaced in an unexpected way just this month. On July 14th, Trump welcomed Iraqi Prime Minister Ali Zaidi to the White House, and during that meeting, he brought up the January 2020 U.S. drone strike that killed Qasem Soleimani, the commander of Iran's Quds Force, along with a senior Iraqi militia deputy. According to the Associated Press, al-Zaidi sidestepped the comment entirely, saying only that he hadn't been involved in politics at the time and preferred to talk about the future. An Iran-aligned coalition of armed groups in Iraq responded on social media afterward, calling Trump's comments a reflection of American arrogance. That single exchange is a useful reminder that the animosity driving these threats didn't start with this war in February. Soleimani's killing, ordered directly by Trump during his first term, has been a live grievance inside Iran's security establishment for more than 6 years. And it gives this entire threat dynamic a longer, more personal history than the current conflict alone would suggest. So let's follow the actual sequence of events that led to this month's dramatic rhetorical escalation, because the timing tells you something important. This all intensified during what was supposed to be a fragile holding ceasefire. According to CNBC's reporting, Trump's threat to decimate and destroy iron came in the same period the Treasury Department sanctioned that alleged Iranian financier, a move Iran itself said violated the preliminary memorandum of understanding the two countries had struck the previous month to wind the war down. At the same time, Iran's foreign minister Abbas Araghchi traveled to Oman, a longtime mediator between Washington and Tehran, for talks aimed at salvaging that same fragile agreement. In other words, the most explosive rhetoric either side has used all war was happening at almost the exact same moment diplomats from both governments were sitting down through an intermediary trying to keep the broader deal alive. That's not a contradiction. That's actually how a lot of high-stakes brinkmanship works in practice. Public threats and private diplomacy aren't mutually exclusive. They often run on parallel tracks, with the threat serving a domestic political purpose, projecting strength to each leader's own base and security establishment, while the quieter diplomatic channel tries to prevent the underlying conflict from actually reigniting into full-scale war. Recognizing both tracks at once is the only way to accurately read what's actually happening here, rather than assuming the loudest public statement is automatically the whole story. Now, here's the detail from this story that deserves its own close look, because it raises a genuinely unusual constitutional question. According to PBS News, Trump has suggested he's left a standing order for a response against Iran if he's assassinated, one that Vice President J.D. Vance would be the one to actually carry out. That's an extraordinary thing for a sitting president to say publicly, and it's worth being precise about what it actually means, legally, because the answer is less straightforward than the dramatic framing suggests. A sitting president doesn't have the constitutional authority to bind a successor to a specific military action in advance. If Trump were assassinated, Vance would become president through the normal line of succession, and at that point, any decision about how to respond to Iran would be his own to make, under his own constitutional authority as commander-in-chief, not an order he'd be legally obligated to execute simply because his predecessor said so beforehand. PBS's own reporting acknowledges this directly, noting there's a real chance Vance could decide not to follow through on what Trump has described, or could respond in an entirely different way. So what's being described here is better understood as a stated intention and a political signal of deterrence, not a binding military order with actual legal force. That distinction matters enormously for how seriously to take the 1,000 missiles threat as an actual operational plan versus a deterrence message aimed at making any assassination attempt look catastrophically costly to whoever might consider it. Threats like this serve a specific strategic purpose, regardless of whether they'd literally be carried out exactly as described. They're designed to raise the perceived cost of an attack high enough that it changes the calculation for anyone contemplating one. Whether Iran's leadership actually believes the threat would be executed in full at that scale is almost beside the point. The message is intended to be heard as absolute, whether or not the reality of a presidential succession and decision-making process would actually play out that cleanly. It's worth putting the scale of that number in perspective, too, since a figure like 1,000 missiles is easy to say and much harder to actually picture. That number would represent a sustained, multi-day bombardment campaign, far beyond a single retaliatory strike, closer in scale to the opening days of a full-scale war than to a targeted response against specific military or leadership sites. Whether the United States could or would actually sustain a barrage of that exact size is a separate question from whether the threat is intended to be taken as a literal operational plan versus a maximalist deterrence statement. Either way, the specific number chosen wasn't accidental. It was chosen to sound total, immediate, and beyond any realistic capacity for Iran to absorb or respond to. There's a quieter, more concrete signal about how seriously Trump's own security team is taking this that's worth including, because it doesn't rely on anyone's rhetoric at all. According to PBS's reporting, Trump flew part of the way back from a NATO summit in Turkey aboard an older Air Force One aircraft rather than the newer Qatari-gifted plane that had been in service, specifically raising questions about security. That newer aircraft, retrofitted at a reported cost of around $400 million, reportedly lacks some of the missile detection and countermeasure systems built into the older jets. A swap like that, quiet, unannounced, and purely operational, tends to tell you more about how a security apparatus is actually assessing real risk than any public statement does, because it's a decision made for protective reasons rather than public messaging. Let's turn to Iran's side of this equation now, because the same critical scrutiny that applies to Trump's rhetoric has to apply to Tehran's as well. Mojtaba Khamenei inherited the position of supreme leader in the immediate aftermath of his father's death in an American airstrike, a transition that happened suddenly in wartime rather than through the more deliberate succession process Iran's system was originally designed around. A new leader consolidating power under exactly those circumstances has an obvious political incentive to project maximum resolve early, and a public vow of revenge against the government that killed his predecessor serves that consolidation purpose, regardless of whether any specific operational plot against Trump personally is actually underway. That doesn't mean the threat isn't real. It means the rhetoric is doing double duty, functioning simultaneously as a genuine security concern for American officials and as a domestic legitimacy tool for a leader who needs to demonstrate strength at the exact moment he's taking power. The funeral itself is worth understanding as a political event, not just a religious one, because of what it reveals about how Iran's leadership is managing this transition publicly. Ayatollah Ali Khamenei's burial took place at the Imam Reza Shrine in Mashhad, one of the holiest sites in Shia Islam, drawing what images from the event show as enormous crowds. Funerals for slain leaders, particularly leaders killed by a foreign adversary, have historically functioned in Iran as moments of maximum national mobilization, and this one was no exception. The imagery that emerged from it, mourners carrying banners threatening Trump directly, was always going to circulate widely and serve a specific narrative purpose for a government eager to demonstrate that grief has translated into resolve rather than vulnerability. Here's the analysis that actually matters underneath all of this noise. Both leaders, right now, have strong incentives to sound maximally uncompromising in public. And both governments, according to the reporting we've covered tonight, are simultaneously continuing quieter diplomatic contact through Oman. Those two facts aren't in tension. They're both true, and understanding this moment requires holding them together rather than picking whichever one makes for a cleaner story. The public threats are real, and they carry real escalation risk, particularly given how easily a single miscalculated action, a strike misread as retaliation, an intelligence tip that turns out to be wrong, could collapse the diplomatic track entirely. But the diplomatic track existing at all in parallel with this rhetoric tells you neither side has fully abandoned the goal of ending this war through negotiation rather than further escalation. It's worth placing this specific moment inside a longer historical pattern, too, because foreign government threats against sitting American presidents aren't unprecedented, even if the scale and public nature of this one is unusual. During his first term, Trump's administration disclosed intelligence suggesting Iran had discussed retaliatory action against senior American officials following the Soleimani strike, without that ever escalating into a confirmed attempt on the president's own life. What's different this time is the combination of factors converging at once. An active shooting war rather than a tense peace, a newly installed Iranian leader with a direct personal loss to avenge, and a level of public threat and counter-threat playing out on social media in real time rather than through the more traditional, quieter diplomatic and intelligence channels these disputes have historically used. That combination is precisely what makes this moment feel qualitatively different from earlier tension between the two governments, even though the underlying grievance, Soleimani's killing, predates this war by more than 6 years. So who actually benefits from this specific moment of heightened threat and counter-threat? In the short term, both leaders gain something domestically. Trump's threat plays to an American political base that responds to displays of strength and resolve, particularly amid a war that's already tested his approval ratings. Mojtaba Khamenei's vow of vengeance helps him establish legitimacy with Iran's security establishment and hardline factions at a moment when a sudden, wartime succession leaves him more vulnerable to internal challenge than a leader who inherited power under calmer circumstances. Neither leader loses anything politically in the near term by sounding as uncompromising as possible in public. The clearer loser, if this rhetoric ever translates into actual action, is obvious and worth stating plainly. Any escalation triggered by an assassination attempt, successful or attempted, would almost certainly end whatever remains of the ceasefire framework entirely, dragging both countries back into the kind of full-scale conflict the June memorandum was originally designed to prevent. And there's a subtler risk sitting underneath that scenario too. A president who has publicly promised an overwhelming automatic response to any attack on his life creates exactly the kind of tripwire that a third party, a proxy group, a rogue actor, or even a false flag provocation designed to look Iranian could exploit to drag both countries into a war that neither government's actual decision makers may have chosen to start on that particular day, under those particular circumstances. Here's what's worth watching in the weeks ahead to see which direction this actually moves. First, watch whether the Treasury sanctions dispute and Iran's claim that it violates the existing memorandum of understanding gets resolved through Araghchi's talks in Oman, or whether it instead becomes the specific issue that finally collapses the ceasefire framework altogether. Second, watch whether any further public details emerge about the alleged assassination plot itself, since additional verifiable specifics would move this from a claim officials are asking the public to trust into something outside experts could actually independently assess. Third, and perhaps most tellingly, watch the security posture around the president himself in the coming weeks. The kind of quiet operational decisions like the Air Force One swap rather than the public statements, since those choices tend to reveal how seriously the people actually responsible for his protection are treating this specific threat, regardless of what either government says for public consumption. Fourth, watch how Mojtaba Khamenei governs in the weeks after his father's funeral, since a leader who continues escalating rhetorically well past the initial mourning period is signaling something different than one who lets the moment pass and pivots back toward the quieter diplomatic track already underway through Oman. Two governments are threatening each other with everything they have in public, while their diplomats sit down quietly through a mediator in Oman. Both things are happening at once, and until one of those two tracks wins out over the other, this war remains exactly what it's been for months, closer to reigniting than anyone negotiating a ceasefire would like to admit. If you found this analysis valuable, subscribe to Breaking News Analysis for in-depth reporting on the stories shaping America's future. I'm David Whitmore. Thank you for watching.